So at this time, we would like to present Alfredo. We already had Karen mention you coming up on the sponsorship accountability side, and I must admit, we're all very excited to see this case study because as we've mentioned, there are so few case studies that have both the ROO and the ROI components inside of it. So with this, we're just going to hand it directly over to you.
Thank you very much, and guessing you can hear me okay. So thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here and share some of the work that we're doing with some of our clients at Kantar. I am part of the brand and marketing ROI practice within analytics at Kantar. And as I always say, that's a very fancy name to say marketing effectiveness. What we do in the practice is everything about measuring and quantifying marketing effectiveness. And part of what we do, like traditional mixed models, attribution, and things of that sort, is also look at what is the effectiveness and return on investment of sponsorship programs. Because as we've been talking, a very, very important part of what brands and companies invest on, and not a lot of sight onto how effective they are and what they're getting in return on those. So, talking about sponsorship, and we, I think, mentioned this already in a couple of instances. While sponsorship is one of the different tools that marketers have to push their brands, to market their brands, they are very different than traditional marketing and advertising tools in the way that they are explicitly built for the long term. And they're explicitly built to drive engagement with consumers or fans and the property that they're partnering with, and to build and shape brand perceptions. And that takes time. That's not going to happen immediately. Ultimately, the goal is to drive sales and usage and acquisition, recruitment, whatever that is for a brand. But it's through a process of brand building and brand shaping perceptions that they're going to get there. So it is different than traditional advertising. And that has to be taken into account when we're trying to measure how they are working and how effective they are. We also talked about briefly how important it is to have that fit and consistency on the way that sponsorships are being activated and executed in the marketplace. It's not only about securing the fees and now being the sponsor, but it's about choosing the right property. And we've seen that in many cases, and that's the chart that you can see over there, the strongest the fee, the more appropriate that fit of the brand and the property that they're trying to partner with, the more effective the sponsorship is going to be. And a lot of times that, believe it or not, that doesn't happen, right? How many times you see that CEO that says, I like golf, so I want to sponsor the PGA, or these universities, my alma mater, so I'm just going to sponsor that, without taking into account if the brand really has a fit with that property, or the audience that the property is reaching is the right audience for the brand, or the audience that we're trying to reach. So looking at that strategic fit and consistency is very important. Consistency is key because, again, you're not going to activate just one time, 1 year, and then walk away from it. Sponsorship effectiveness relies on the consistency and the execution, the activation over a long period of time. And we talked about securing the fees is not enough. Activation is key. Just paying the rights for the sponsorship will not make the sponsorship effective. Activation is very important. And one of the things that we have noticed as well is it requires about 50% or more of what a brand spends in rights to put on activation to actually get an effective program going on. So the assets and the activation that go with the sponsorship program are very important, and it's something that needs to be also reviewed and well thought from brands in terms of, what's the type of package that I wanna buy? Can I switch certain assets for others that are more effective for my brand? And that is also something that we do with our clients. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And we talked about this evolution and how we see it here at MASB, and it's very similar to the way that we actually see it at Kantar as well, where a lot of brands and companies start with media equivalency, and for many reasons that's maybe the most spread solution out there. There's many companies that can do that. Then they evolve to looking into ROI metrics, brand perceptions, how is that moving the way that people or fans think about the brands. And ultimately, what now they're trying to achieve is to understand what is the financial value, what is that return that I'm getting from these sponsorship programs for particular activations and over time for the entire program overall as well. It's become one of the most important questions across many companies, and you can see it recurringly coming more and more often. And I think that we all agree that that's maybe one of the areas where companies have the least visibility in terms of performance and return. So at Kantar, we actually have a portfolio of different measurement tools and solutions that, funny enough, map very nicely to the way that we see it here at MASB as well. So we have sponsorship evaluation, which is the whole equivalency piece, and we do also a lot of assessments on ROI and brand impact. And recently, we've taken a lot of efforts and research that we've done to put more push on measuring the actual financial value that sponsorship programs are driving for brands. And that's where we're focusing and working a lot with our clients nowadays. We built a framework to get to that measurement of the effectiveness of a sponsorship program that basically looks at those three core objectives that any sponsorship program has very underneath. Understanding what is the impact on brand perceptions, how the sponsorship program is driving different metrics around what we call brand perceptions or brand equity. And this is, again, we saw some of these in the previous presentation, from brand awareness, from sponsorship awareness, to many other different ROI metrics that are important. Impact on engagement is also very critical, and especially nowadays with social media and in the digital world, that has exploded and enhanced a lot how consumers and fans engage with brands and properties. So measuring and quantifying that engagement is also critical to understand how those sponsorship programs are working. At the end of the day, sponsorships and partnerships are linked to passion points of the group of consumers that we're trying to reach. And that's what's going to drive that engagement. A truly effective sponsorship is that one that is creating that full engagement, not only with the brand, but with the property as a trifecta that's going to drive that higher perception on the brand and ultimately consumption. And the third part is that impact on revenue. So how these engagement and brand perception impacts that we're measuring, how do they translate ultimately into sales or consumption or acquisition, whatever the metric is, that will drive revenue for the brand in the long term. So as you can imagine, what happens and what we have seen across different programs that we've measured over time and across different industries, there are two impacts that a sponsorship program is generating for a brand. What we call the direct impact, and that's something that you will see most immediately in relatively the short term. And there's what we call the brand equity impact, and that's the long-term impact that the sponsorship is going to be generating. And not surprisingly, as you can see, that brand equity impact is in many cases the most important of the two. It's really where the true impact of a sponsorship program relies. And I always, tell people, I'm not going to jump off the couch and get a new rocket mortgage because they are sponsors of the NFL, and I just happen to see that, right? I don't need a mortgage right now, but maybe 2 years from now, 6 months from now, when I need it, I'm going to be aware of that. My perceptions about that brand are going to be positive, that I'm going to have that brand in my consideration set, and I will go through the path to maybe secure a mortgage through Rocket Mortgage. But a lot of the brands, people are just not going to immediately increase or buy them because they are sponsors of the program, right? Etihad Airlines, I'm not going to buy a ticket to Saudi Arabia just because I watch a Manchester City game over the weekend, right? But eventually, it clicks in, and it's that repetition, it's that long term, it's how they are interacting with the property that is going to drive that value for fans that ultimately will translate into revenue for the brands. Oh, very, very quickly, just in terms of methodology, the way that we look at this is there's two impacts, so we need to read two different impacts. The short-term impact, the immediate impact is read through different models, if you will, depending on the brand and depending on the data that we have available. Sometimes you can have these read on a traditional marketing mix model if the data is available and if the brand is a good match for that. Sometimes we do slightly different models, pre-post, exposed, non-exposed type of thing to read that direct impact. And then we have a secondary model where we actually look at first how the sponsorship program is shaping, changing key brand perceptions and engagement metrics, and we translate those into revenue for the long term. The way that we do that translation of how brand equity translates into revenue for a brand is basically leveraging the Kantar brand C evaluation methodology, which is built exactly to understand what is the true financial value of a brand, taking away all the short-term nuances and noise that a brand has, and looking at that core brand contribution that we call it within our framework, and understand if the sponsorship program, through shaping key brand metrics, is changing that brand contribution from a period prior to the activation of the sponsorship versus when the sponsorship was activated. And by looking at those differences, then through the model, we can translate that into actual revenue for a brand. So as you can see, one of the key components or inputs for this type of assessment is we need to understand how brand perceptions are shifting and are moving when people are exposed or not to the programs, or before or after certain events are happening. We use this framework for many different types of sponsorship programs, not only long-term sponsorships like the NFL, like as a whole season, or MLB that lasts 6 to 8 months. We use this also for example, for the Super Bowl. We generate a report actually every year where we look at all the 55 ads that are aired during the Super Bowl, and we use the same framework to see how impactful each of these ads are in the long term driving revenue for the brands. We can use this also for experiential marketing. So very specific, low reach events, 100 people, 1,000 people that are attending a concert or that are attending a very specific movie screening or things like that are sponsored or in partnership with certain brands. As long as we can get a read of how people are thinking about those brands before and after, we can start making some assessment as to how the program is working. So here's a couple of examples before I go into the big case study here. Major telco brand where we read their MLB sponsorship. In this case, we were doing different waves, looking at brand perceptions, and you see very interesting patterns depending on the brand, depending on the property that they are evaluating. In this particular case, you see increase in sponsorship awareness at the beginning of the season, preseason time. Then it goes down a little bit, but then it ramps up as the season goes on. You get to the All-Star game, and it peaks out at the end of the season with the World Series. And all this information, then we use it to measure, as you can see on the right-hand side, key brand metrics, key ROI metrics, translate that into our brand equity framework through the concept of brand power in our case, and translate that into revenue. In this particular case, the program for that year was generating a 2.6% lift in revenue for the brand. That translates into a gross margin ROI of 3.1. And this number now is a number that clients or the brands can take to the CFO and not only show how much or how effective the program is, but also is somehow comparable, and it allows them to have a conversation against all the other paid media and all the other advertising and marketing tactics that the CFO or the C-suite is trying to make an assessment of where to allocate and where to put dollars.
So are you using the media mix modeling to calculate these figures?
For the short term, for the immediate piece, yes, we use some sort of mixed models or surrogates to that, but the biggest driver is the brand equity piece. It's a combination of the two. We did this also for experiential programs, more like a few hundreds or thousands of people, in this case, attending a concert, and same concept, right? We can see because we're through surveys we're obtaining this information. We can break also the information and the results by consumer segments, by age groups, by fans versus non-fans. And that allows also to go deeper into understanding where the program is working. One of the things that we have learned by doing this assessment across different brands is there are assets that work better for certain consumer groups than others, right? So digital assets, live streaming assets are going to work better for younger generations, millennials, Gen Z. And sometimes when we're working with a credit card company, prospects versus current card holders versus non-card holders, assets work differently depending on who you're trying to reach or who you're reaching with your program. So this allows to understand, where the sponsorship program or the partnership program is working. Which are the key dimensions, key brand perceptions that the program is actually touching and impacting. Sometimes you're going to see, and we see these very, very often when we're looking at the Super Bowl ads, for example, right? A Doritos ad is not going to increase the awareness of the brand. Doritos has 100% awareness already. And they're not running a Super Bowl ad to increase awareness. They're doing it to move other pieces of the brand perceptions, but not necessarily awareness. So depending on the brand, depending on the objective, you can measure all this information to understand exactly what the brand what the sponsorship program is doing for your brand. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned, we translate this into impact on brand power or brand equity. This particular example of a concert has had a huge impact on those fans or consumers that attended the concert, increasing their perceptions, the brand equity, by 7 points. And that actually translates into an increase in revenue of almost 5%, 700K, which brings the event ROI to 2.8. So once we have that translation into revenue, getting into the ROI is pretty straightforward. We know and we can get all the costs from the client.
Alfredo, you may want to expand on the notion of brand contribution, because I think that was Jerry's question. How are we moving from ROO, looking at the improvement in brand perceptions, to an ROI, right? I think that's what he was trying to ask.
Yeah. So the brand C methodology, which is what we use to do that translation, is a framework that Kantar has to do brand valuation. And the way the framework works is it looks at the total value of a brand. Say, you have a brand that is worth $3 billion. But that's not really the value that the brand equity is driving for the brand. There's many intangibles, there's all your advertising, there's all your trade promotion pieces that are adding to that brand value. So the valuation methodology, what it does, it first takes out all those short-term impacts. In this case, through the marketing mix model and stuff like that, you take that out. And the idea is to get to what is the core value, financial value of a brand. And of that core value, how much is driven by brand equity? And that's what we call brand contribution. Brand contribution is the percentage of the brand value, financial value, that is driven by brand equity. If you know that, let's say that you know that the brand contribution for your brand is 30%, and then suddenly you execute a sponsorship program and you see amongst the people that were impacted by that program, the contribution now is 32%, then you can very quickly do the math and realize what the financial impact of those 2% points gain is. So that's what we do. We go all the way to the brand contribution concept to tease out, and then basically we do a comparison before and after, or exposed versus non-exposed.
We do have a question.
Yep.
The question is, if I understand correctly, you are calculating ROI based on the ratio between incremental revenue and execution costs, ? Should you not be using incremental margin?
The ROI can be calculated different ways, and actually depending on the brand, the client that we're working with, it could be a true, or straightforward revenue ROI, which in this case it's the incremental revenue brought by or driven by the program divided by not only the activation cost, but sometimes you need to include your fee cost as well, and you can spread out across years and things like that. And sometimes it can be a profit or a gross margin ROI. It really depends on what the client is using as the metric for comparison. What the methodology does, it provides you what is the incremental revenue generated by the sponsorship program. And from there you can calculate many different types of ROIs.
So to add to that, going back, it's so great to see this, Alfredo, because you may not know, but during my time at Kantar, I and my team initiated the work with Visa, and I had no idea that it was still going on. So it's splendid. Also the Super Bowl. But I think to kind of add to what Alfredo said, it's the brand contribution looks at incremental revenue and earnings streams generated by investment in the brand, in this case, investment in the sponsorship, or people who are aware of the sponsorship and liked it. You have to take out people who don't like it. So it can go straight down, it can flow straight down into earnings, and then you just offset the costs against it. So it's pretty simple. Yeah.
Correct.
Joanna was one of the architects of Brand C, so she knows the concept like the back of her hand.
Yeah, well, I didn't realise you guys were still doing it with Visa and the NFL, Super Bowl as well, because yeah, I'm very familiar with both of those, so it gives me a lot of pleasure.
So I'm going to take you through a case study of large global financial services brand. What we did recently this year, actually, for a portfolio of sponsorship programs, their largest sports sponsorship programs that they're executing. So the objective that they had was, they really needed to know not only how the programs individually perform, but what is the impact that it has on brand metrics and its overall business for the brand. And going deeper into understanding which are the assets that were activated that are working really well for the program, and which are the assets that maybe need to be either optimized for execution, or maybe sometimes you just need to swap them and say, this asset is really not a good one for my program, and I need to put my money somewhere else in terms of assets. And they also wanted to understand what is the impact of the program on a very specific group of consumers, the Gen Z and younger millennials. This is a group that right now the brand is trying to get because of the evolution of payment and getting into digital payments, right? So getting into these cohorts or consumer groups is very important for the brand. So we did our analysis for the three big sponsorship programs that they executed, which were the Tokyo Olympics, the NFL season that from last year, and the Beijing Winter Olympics. And funny enough, they were executed almost one right after the other, which also allowed them to look at what is the impact of having that execution versus having the NFL, for example, execution that they did the prior year on its own without anything else surrounding that. And a lot of many different learnings. Here you can see looking at the brand metrics, the ROI metrics, how the sponsorship program is helping in different dimensions, from awareness to affinity to consideration and things like that. And you can see that the programs, depending on the sponsorship, were working in different ways against the different dimensions. Tokyo Olympics seem to be the most effective at, in this particular case, shaping and moving brand perceptions. When we look at the brand equity, the brand power metric that we use before we translate that into brand contribution, the programs were also very, very effective and very successful at driving that brand power. You can see here, the brand power of this particular brand, how it jumps the moment that the Tokyo Olympics program comes in. It starts dwindling down, and that's very normal for these type of programs. If you're not reminding people about it, they're gonna eventually part of it is gonna go away. But before it came down altogether, the NFL program came in, and that gave them another boost to brand power. And then right after that, not even the NFL program had ended, Beijing came in right on the heels of the Super Bowl and gave the brand yet another lift on brand power, which is a great case or example of when you have those type of activations, and in particular for the audiences that overlap, because not all the three programs work across the same audiences, but they have a big overlap. For that overlap of audiences, it has a huge impact to grow the brand power of the brand dramatically. In this case, we're talking double-digit points of growth on brand power in a matter of almost 6 months, 6 to 8 months. And then we translate that into what is the impact that each of the sponsorship program had on revenue for the brand, incremental annualized revenue for the brand, and calculated the ROI. So We're not showing here all the actual financials and all that stuff for confidentiality reasons, but you can see on the sponsorship side, on the sponsorship ROI side, it's very positive. Tokyo ROI being the most effective in this particular case. NFL actually improved its effectiveness versus the prior year, and part of it is because it was also executed now along with the other two programs. And Beijing, even if it had the lowest ROI, it's still very positive. One of the interesting learnings that we had here was, again, the impact on different consumer groups was very, very differentiated. Millennials, Young Z groups were not very impacted from a program like the Summer Olympics. But Winter Olympics, it was very different. That cohort, that group reacted and responded very well to Winter Olympics. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. They like more the extreme sports. The brand actually activated more on digital assets for the Winter Olympics, and that had also a good return for them. And going into the assets, here we're looking at the top 5 assets for each of the programs. They activated maybe 12 to 15 assets on each program, but we're looking here at the top 5. And what I wanted to show here is how different programs will have assets working differently for them. Obviously, you can see TV ads being consistently the one that is the most important across all of them. But after that, the assets vary differently from one program to another, which also provides a lot of good information on how to execute and where to optimize for the next round of activations for each of these programs.
Hey, we have some questions coming in.
Yep.
So let me start here. The first one we have is from Jim Meyer. He says, just a comment, coming from Molson Coors, where we had a portfolio of sponsorships, there is significant value in understanding how ROI on different sponsorships compare to one another and how they might complement one another for additive impact. Mm-hmm. So it's additive impact is the key thing. The ROIs really just need to be directionally accurate to have value. Any comment from you on those thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, you're never going to get to a perfect measurement of ROI ever on anything, right? It's all based on models and statistics, which by definition are imperfect. I think that the important thing, as he mentions here, is to have a measurement that is consistent across all your programs. If you're measuring all the different programs consistently using the same methodology, it doesn't matter if the ROI is 3 or 4 or 7, but that allows you to do the comparison against all of them. The important thing I would say is you want to make sure that it's also comparable to the other ROIs measurement that you have across your company. Because what is going to happen, and what's happening more and more with many brands and companies, is that they're trying to say, okay, what is the sponsorship program? What is the NFL program doing for me versus my traditional summer campaign from traditional marketing? And they're trying to start comparing those more and more. So you need to make sure that those are comparable. That's the only thing. But yeah, as long as they're directional, I think it's useful enough for brands. And how they work in complement, in tandem, is also very important. And this example here that we just went through is one of those where we saw that the activation, one right after the other, didn't allow for that decrease after a program that we usually see. And instead, it just helped to build on top of that. And companies, like Molson Coors, Coca-Cola, those that have multiple sponsorship programs, that's exactly what they're trying to do, right? To stay relevant with the different audiences throughout time, with all the different programs on top of their advertising efforts as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the SAM team hasn't really addressed the staging aspect yet. And the staging, in advertising portion, you would have air refresh, and you would ratchet up. You would build accordingly. But we haven't really done that on the sponsorship side yet.
There's also Jim's question about portfolio. So databasing becomes really important because, especially for companies like his that is investing in a whole lot of things, which is working among which consumer audiences so that you're planning ahead. For most paid media, you do your channel optimization. So they have a good idea about this is what I should do. But sponsorships, it's not getting that kind of attention and scrutiny about how do we optimize your portfolio for what objectives, for which audiences. And I think until we have that built up discipline, they won't get there. So it's a great question, and I think that's exactly what they need to do.
Yeah, I would say we haven't gotten to the staging aspect, but Satya, to your point, one of the discussions we've been having within the SAM team is the extent to which you may have higher ROIs on smaller properties. So being the big fish in the small sea. So just being able to have a relative variation in terms of consistent ROI measurement. You could have very high ROI, but in the absence of understanding, kind of the narrowness of the audience and the difference in the objectives, you're going to be making the wrong kind of comparison.
Yeah, that's very important. You can see the example with the concert that I was talking about. Huge ROI, right? So maybe the ROI was 5 or whatever it was, but the audience that was reached by that program is very limited versus an NFL sponsorship program that is reaching, almost 100 million people in the US. So even if it has an ROI of 2 or 1.5, when you translate that into actual revenue, it makes sense, right? So that is very important to take into account.
What are because you've done enough sort of sponsorship measurement across many different types of sponsorships and brands. So what are the major learnings and lessons you would have for marketers from this? I'm thinking about this because thinking back to when we originally designed the NFL sponsorship measurement, I seem to remember that one of the key findings was that the sponsorship ROI was very different by type of industry and by product. And one of the striking things I remember is the one that doesn't work, they haven't stopped doing it, was movies. No ROI, yeah. They still carry on doing it, but that it was very different, highest on beer and chips and, various other things. Again, it depended on, what they were trying to achieve. But are there any sort of key takeaways, advice you would give marketers from all this work?
Yeah, well, what I would say, if we try to generalize sponsorships and partnerships overall, I would say overall sponsorship programs work. They do work, but the impact comes in the long term. So you need to be looking at that long-term impact if you really want to make an assessment of that program. It's not really fair to put sponsorship on a marketing mix model and try to use that ROI because it's not reading the whole thing. So that is maybe the biggest learning to me is they work, but they work in the long term, so measure it from that perspective. And the other learning that I find really, really fascinating, and it provides a lot of tools for brands, is the assets work very differently depending on the audience that you're trying to reach. So knowing that, which assets to activate against a particular audience or which assets work in one program versus another program, it's super powerful for the brands because they can now have a saying when they are buying their packages and say, no, I don't want the board here. I want the logo on the jersey because that's what really works. Or I don't want a fan mosaic thing. I want the halftime report or whatever it is. So knowing how the assets work, it's also critical for brands to understand.
The couple of other learnings is the impact on corporate reputation is such a big thing. So it may not actually be immediate revenue, but and think about GoDaddy. Before anybody knew what exactly they did, we always knew GoDaddy as a brand because of their presence in Super Bowl and those things. And that does impact finally when you're trying to think about your small business customers. The second thing is we are still talking about impact on consumers or customers. There's this other big element of what does it do for your trade partners? What does it do for the CEO who's making a big decision when you're looking at health insurance? What does it do for your employees to engage them? So there's a whole lot more that we still haven't fully covered in terms of the impact.
Yeah, Coca-Cola calls them the intangibles, and they do know that there's a lot of value, for example, of them sponsoring the World Cup, and all the retailers being excited about that because they're going to get better real estate at stores for their displays for the World Cup activation that they're going to do. So there's a lot of intangible value that can also be measured, and for many brands, it's also very important to have a read on that because it adds to why are we doing this? There's an intangible value of securing that prime spot in the store by just being the sponsor. They're not going to give it to other brands just because they're not sponsoring the World Cup.
Employee piece, because I do seem to remember from the Super Bowl that there's a whole number of major brands that actually are only doing it for employees. Yeah.
We haven't actually done that, but there is the most easiest way of doing it is some HR-related metrics on easy to hire people, easy to retain people. So it's really, there is we can talk about approaches to do that, but we haven't actually done that for any brand. Most of the time it's more the most immediate thing about did we change our revenue, did we change our growth potential, but not the full holistic picture that's still a very important part of this investment.
I wanted to make one comment, and I wanted to go back to your opening statement because you talked about activation. And we actually talk about this in the sponsorship series article, not in terms of how much you need to spend. And you talked about the different assets bring different value. But we had a very, very simple learning that we published, and we said the acid test for your activation should be if somebody else can come in and spend the same amount of money as you in the category, you haven't done a sufficient job of activating because you haven't gotten to why you are there. What is your reason for being there that separates you from the rest of the pack in your category? It's kind of that simple.
We're going to have one more, and we'll wrap it up.
I greatly appreciate all these comments. To me, what's kind of resonating with me is just the notion of a brand personality, which seems to be like critical to this whole puzzle. Because you would think that, like, both on the customer side and the employee side, that as these activations happen through these partnerships, that it would trigger, if done correctly, it would trigger some sort of an association with these types of brand characteristics that are associated with the NFL or Red Bull or whatever it might be, that would start to change those personality characteristics over time if done correctly, right? So, and that's what I think these brands would want to do, in addition to the ROI in terms of revenue and things, but to have these affective sort of associations with brands, both on the customer side, but also employees want to go to work for companies that embody shared values, those certain characteristics. I think that would show up over time.
Yeah, and I don't know if you caught it on one of the first slides. It said that one of the key objectives of sponsorship is to shift brand perceptions, right? Because we know that brands evolve over time, and they, we're living it right now. They want to be more sustainable. They want to support certain causes now, and they want the audiences and consumers to think about those brands in those ways. So finding the right partnerships, finding the right properties that will allow them to enhance those values and those perceptions is critical. It's the most important thing just getting a sponsorship for the sake of a sponsorship is maybe the first, the best way to go nowhere. That's why the whole brand fit analysis is also very important, just to make sure that you're right on supporting your values and your vision as a brand.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Very much.
Very insightful.